IVM.
Hi everybody, just wanted to ask everyone for a quick favor. We're running a brand survey right now and would really appreciate it if you could let us know what you think about the advertising on IVM. Go to ivmpodcast.com/survey and do let us know. As part of this, we'll be selecting 10 random participants and sending them some IVM swag, so do fill out those surveys.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello, I'm Sarthak, an associate fellow with the Takshashila institution, and I welcome you to a special episode of All Things Policy. The two N's meet. So for this episode, I have with me two N's, Narayan, Ramachandran, and Nitin Pai. I'm recording with Narayan and Nitin for the first time, though they have been my teachers in the past. I did my PGP with Takshashila, they were the teachers. And right now they are my colleagues at Takshashila. Hi Nitin, hi Narayan.
Hi, Sarthak. Good to be here.
Hi, Sarthak. I didn't know that there was this teacher relationship which you're going to bring up.
It is a significant part. So in this episode, we are going to discuss about post-pandemic inequalities and some solutions for the same. But before that, I just have a small announcement. At Takshashila, we offer a variety of courses in public policy. The application for our next cohorts have started. The last date of application is 28th August. If you are interested in public policy, in a career in public policy, or generally in public policy, you can go and check our website for more details. So coming back to the present episode, as we record this episode, more than 200 million people world over have been impacted by the COVID-19 virus. They have contracted the virus. There have been more than 4.2 billion deaths. And in India, there is again a fear of a third wave. In the last 18 months or so, to deal with the pandemic, different nation states have used different kind of measures. And as they have used different kind of confinement measures, economic activities have been constrained, they have been restricted. And the impact of this has not been same for all the different sections of the society. And as things stand now, we are witnessing a new type of inequality, post-pandemic inequality. So Nitin, last year, if I remember it correctly, in the month of June, you had written an article on post-pandemic inequalities. So, Nitin, how do you see the post-pandemic inequalities panning out?
Thanks, Sarthak. Actually, I'm glad you mentioned it, the date. Actually, I think it was clear as early as June 2020, at least to me. I'm sure a lot of people would have realized it much earlier, that the effect of the pandemic is going to be very different from anything that we've seen in our living memory. So a lot of us who believe in free markets and capitalism don't really worry too much about inequality. And I've been saying this for the last 25 years, that a growing country like India, a growing economy like India should not be obsessed with inequality, because growth is the most important objective. As long as you grow, everybody gets prosperous. Of course, during a growth phase, there will be inequalities, but the time to think about those inequalities is not now. The time to think about it is when you've acquired some kind of respectable levels of per capita income, average per capita income. But when it came to COVID, the thing was very different because it was an asymmetric shock affecting the most vulnerable people in our population in an unfair kind of a way, right? And I saw that there were two kinds of economic impacts. One is a very temporary one, okay, severe but temporary. This is like a loss of a job, loss of income, pay cuts. Some businesses may have to close down for certain reasons. A shortage of working capital. They have to go and borrow. The losses. So all of these are severe, painful, but short term. And most economic agents have an ability to tide over this in some form. And even if the government does not help in some way, even if public policy does not help in some way, there are some ways you can tide over this. The second kind of economic impact was more serious. Right? That's the more permanent, long-lasting impact. In a way, these are the kind of things which would affect people's life chances, or maybe generations of life chances. And there were four which I identified at that time. The first is an impact on health. A health event in the best of times would have set back our people severely because of lack of insurance, costs of medical care, poor access to medical facilities, etc. So, and this was health impact on a massive scale to the individual, to the family. The second was in terms of education, because what is the value of a person who loses? What is the loss of the to a person who loses 1 year of school or 2 years of school, and at a person who's in a vulnerable segment of the population in terms of lower income groups, rural areas, etc. And that is a massive loss because it's the opportunity cost of it is just mind-boggling. The third was in terms of the digital divide of two types, where certain jobs which could be done online could carry on in some form, but there were certain jobs which just couldn't be done online. And what happens to these jobs? These are entire categories of jobs, and large numbers of our people were engaged in this kind of jobs. You're a plumber, you're a carpenter, you're a beautician. Many of these jobs might change and transform in ways that we can't imagine, right? And even within the population which is working from home, there was another kind of digital divide where women had to do housework as well as office work while working from home and childcare. The burden on certain types of people was worse. And for example, employees who had better internet access would do better at work, and employees that don't would have suffered, right? So that would exacerbate those kind of divides. And finally, and I think this worries me, in a much larger sense than just India, is loss of mobility. Because moving away from your home to a different location, which gave you better economic and social opportunities, was a massive transformational agent in India. A lot of people have written about it. It's not just that you move to a different place which has better economic prospects, but also the ability to come out of the social setting which you were trapped in. The inequalities and inequities of social settings in India we all know, but being able to move out of them and move to a different place, different location, different settings was a liberating experience which has been lost. So I think all of these make this an unprecedented and a very different kind of crisis, or a different kind of agent which creates inequality. And I am seriously worried about these things. So that's why when Narayan and we were speaking yesterday, we said, hey, let's talk about this and try and discuss this out and thrash things out.
So, Nitin, again, thank you for framing that eloquently. I'd like to add sort of two dimensions to the debate. Let me start with a metaphor. I was going to use a 100 meters race, just given that it's Olympics time, but I'm going to switch to a marathon metaphor because ultimately the development of a large heterogeneous country like India is more a marathon than it is a 100-meter dash. But think of running a marathon with a starting point for some people a mile back, right? So it's tough enough to run a marathon in 2 hours and some, but if now I have to add an additional mile and I'm one mile behind the rest, or 2 kilometers behind the rest, if you will, that makes it that much harder. And if additionally I tell you that I have not been a great marathoner in the past, so I'm just catching up to being a world-class marathoner, and that is sort of the definition of vulnerable that Nitin was getting to. So we have a situation where, due to no fault of any single segment of society, many people have been pushed a mile back. And it looks like the marathon has gotten going again, and the weather is fair, and in fact there's a bit of a tailwind. So we are being head faked into believing that the marathon is being run fine. But I think we are not looking hard enough to see evidence of the fact that a whole chunk of people are stuck at the back, at least a mile behind the first group. So that's the metaphor I would carry in my head when we talk about this equality of opportunity. We are by no means saying, make them a mile ahead or give them other handicaps which makes people finish at the same time as the leader. But you have to start at the same place and then take your chances in a competitive world. And we've just had an exogenous shock that doesn't permit that. To add a couple of nuances to what Nitin said on, each of the elements that you're talking about, there are actually second order effects, which, if to use the popular metaphor today, is sort of like long COVID in education, it's long COVID in employment, it's long COVID in self-employment, which is frankly what substantial part of India is. That the supply chains, the access to finance in the informal sector, etc., have set, and certainly in education, particularly for those in poorer households who are not able to do it using laptops and other such devices. I mean, the digital divide is one thing, but even within the digital divide, there are plenty of nuances. So I would say to you, there are first and second order effects that set back whole segments of society that we need to pay some special attention to, so that the cyclical recovery that is upon us doesn't head fake us into believing that everything is fine and things will just, with a little pause of 9 months or so, things will return to normal in 2022, 23. I do think that there will be a gap that is created for several segments of society. And until we're mindful of that gap, we will have uh, we will have consequences later on that will dog us in our development path.
Narayan, actually, even before the pandemic, what used to worry me was the fact that there was little purchasing addition to purchasing power. Right, consumer surplus was not adding up. So even before the pandemic hit us, while a lot of the Arvind Subramaniams were talking about double balance sheet, this, that, and the other, what concerned me was that people were not able to spend. Right, until you are able to stimulate demand, create incentives for people to spend, put money in the pockets of people, or rather allow money to remain in the pockets of people, you're not going to be able to do much for economic recovery, right? And now you have a situation where incomes are depressed. Large numbers of people are going to suffer long-term impairments to their spending power. I think even the short-term economic recovery looks a little startling to me. I mean, stock markets, etc., are behaving in their own ways, but I can't see how the economy can recover to rates of growth rates of about 8 to 10% on a sustained basis at this rate, right? Unless something else is done.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, there is a cyclical recovery going on, Nitin, and that's simply because of depressed bases. Number one, number two, there is just enormous amount of liquidity sloshing around in the world, and that obviously lifts markets, and which in turn has positive, money multiplier consequences to the economy. So, in the very short term, my worry is actually the opposite, that the success of the IPOs and the success of the market actually leads people to believe that this was a 9 month pause button and we now press play. But to use yet another metaphor, you're pressing play, but there are two types of sound that are coming from the vocal machine. One is humming, and the other is actually at much slower speed. The economists have used various terms like K-shaped recovery and so on to describe this, but it's really that delta between one segment of the economy and the other segment of the economy, because you didn't start at the same place, and the fact that you're not starting at the same place has been caused by an exogenous shock. You're right, Nitin, that we shot ourselves in the foot a few times in the last 5-6 years. That has caused other kind of pain. But even despite that, I just think, just purely from the pandemic, we've set ourselves back in some segments of society. And if we don't pay attention to that, we're going to have a very uneven recovery.
Narayan, this entire idea or entire way of describing it, that it's that there will be second order shocks, and this was an second order impacts, and this was an exogenous shock. It actually helps us understand the problem better. In the last, for example, in some of these communities who have been at the bottom, when it comes to life chances, when it comes to life outcomes, say they already don't have the capacity to deal with different kinds of shocks. On top of that, there is this health shock, and at present, I mean, they might be in some kind of occupations where you can't possibly work from home. Their spending power will not be there. And also in future, you don't know how many waves will be there. So there is massive amount of unpredictability in the future as well. So this impact they might have faced in the last 1.5 years, but this again, the issues that are going to be there for them will be there for some time now. It's not necessarily going to get reduced, or this all these issues that they have faced, it will be balanced in the immediate future. So we have to think about some ways to address this. So when we think of the solutions, what should be the fundamental principle behind the solutions? What should we be trying to do here?
So I would start by saying, first, identify and be aware that this is even a problem. Because my worry is people are thinking that this cyclical hard recovery that is happening now is evidence of their brilliant governance. And far from it, it is actually reacting simply because of global liquidity. And therefore, we will, first of all, I think the most important first step is to be aware that this cyclical recovery has no real bearing on medium term recovery. And unless we practice both specific solutions related to these groups that have been unfairly impacted and continue on the reform path. So these are two parallel ideas, but you will need to do both in order to catch up to a, I'm just going to pick a number, but 8% growth rate on a forward basis, say 2-3 years from now.
But one issue we might have is, I mean, measuring this impact, right? Generally, we don't have ways by which, or at least we do not have institutional setups to measure the impact of the pandemic on different sections of the society.
Yes, but that doesn't absolve us of the need to do it. As you know, we don't even measure the labor market properly. So for us to get involved in trying to identify which segments of the informal labor market are deeply impacted by this will be. I mean, as you know, for instance, the migrant issue has come up at least twice in the past, and at 2 times in the past with each wave. And each of those are representative of quite a big both societal and economic shock that we have been through. So we'd better get our act together. That is exactly what I'm calling the awareness of the fact that there is this issue requires us to first measure it a little bit more precisely, and then to begin to get at solutions, which we'll talk about in a second. But awareness and measurement are critical to solving the problem.
Yeah, so this is the first step that we should take up. And yeah, we will come to the solutions. So we'll have a break, and post the break, we will talk about some of the potential solutions.
Hey, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On Cyrus Says, Chunky Pandey brings the nostalgia for the 90s while sharing his journey as an actor. We'd like to welcome Audiogan to the network. It's an old show about design. We want to kick off this season with Jay Datta, design-headed Make My Trip and Go Ivy Bo. He's also the founder of Design Up. On The Habit Coach, get to know more about human mind and curiosity. On This Round Is On Me, we dive deep into the electric vehicles and what the cars of the future are going to look like. On The Wire Talks, a fascinating conversation on why the poet Kabir is not only significant but relevant to our times. And on Advertising is Dead, let's understand internet culture, meme marketing, and lots more. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any other show for that matter, please do tell a friend. Word of mouth is the best way to spread the word about a podcast you love. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors this week: CEAT, Cred, Global Victoria, Bank of Baroda, Intuit India, and CoinSwitch Kuber.
Welcome back. So we were talking about some potential solutions. Nitin, you wanted to say something.
See, I think the answer ultimately still remains economic growth, right? The answer still remains that you need to quickly get back onto the path of economic growth such that the economy creates resources and wealth that can be used for whatever you want to do. Now, once you have that growth engine back up and running, you can think about how to ameliorate some of these problems. But then the critical difference here is that you can't wait for that economic growth to pick up in order to address some of these inequalities right now. That I think is the big difference I would make between conventional type of inequality related debates versus this one. Because here it is important to equip a large number of people, a large fraction of the workforce, with the ability to create growth. So in that sense, it's the chicken and the egg, or the horse and the cart equation sort of is changed in this, because you cannot create growth on a sustained basis until people have incomes, and they can enjoy, they see that there is some kind of security in the future, so that they can spend that money instead of saving it or buying gold or land and keeping it under the mattress or whatever, right? So this is an important, I would say, sequence of events that needs to happen. And now public policy therefore has to address it, right? So if it means that you have to figure out how to provide income support to specific sets of people, how you provide relief to certain sets of people, how do you provide maybe public health, improve public health in such a manner that there is no additional healthcare expense which people have to incur. So massive investments in health. And what I would call something like this multi-contributor social security, where you don't necessarily see social security as a responsibility of the state or the responsibility of the employer, but bring whole of society into it. Make sure that philanthropy, charity, CSR, employers, foreign funders, governments can all contribute to social security, right? And that's probably an idea waiting to happen, especially in these circumstances. But those are unpacked ideas, all of which are debatable. But the larger idea is that you've got to ensure that people have incomes and they see security, which enables them to spend a part of that income. Unless you get this dynamic going, I think it's going to be hard to create sustained economic growth, which will get us all out of this hole.
Yeah, Sarthak, if I could take a slightly different angle to it and stick with the idea of second order effects that will need solutions. So let me give you an example. So in education, let's think about 4 types of people, right? Obviously, the comparison set is to a physical class, primary or middle school class that we went to, say, in 2019, right? Keep that as sort of the baseline. Against that baseline, you have one air-conditioned room in which the child has, a backup internet and somebody providing cut fruit every hour, right? So that's one type of student. A second type of student is by hook or by crooks. The student and the household has acquired a laptop and or a Chromebook in order to access the education. And a third one is a faltering light, occasional electricity, mobile only, inconsistent 4G child. Okay. And then yet another is no access to internet at all kind of child. So if you take the range of this, the nuance comes in because when all of this is over, you will need to provide a catch-up set of steps to one or more of those segments. Because if you don't do that, half a generation will actually grow up. As it is, our quality indicators in educations are relatively poor. But what it will now happen is you will have a divide even in that generation, where those people who have no access to internet or have to do it off a mobile phone will learn very differently from those who have the access to notebooks or laptops and so on. So that requires a specific intervention. Similarly, in public health, we're talking about public health related to COVID. Absolutely understandable. But what has happened in the meantime is whole host of children have interrupted their vaccination protocols. Unless we take a very specific effort to ensure that what was missed last year is gotten this year, there's going to be cognitive impacts of that lack of vaccination on, again, a tenth of a generation or a 1/4 of a generation. So these are, we have to be very, very mindful of this gap, that it is not uniform. In upper middle class households, there is a nice vaccination chart that has been saved on the cloud somewhere, and if you miss it on this date, you can call your pediatrician on Zoom and make sure that you can go and get it done next time that it's available. but it's not true for Bethia in Bihar, or Nagapattinam, or Pathanamthitta district in Kerala. Even that will happen uniformly for all kids.
And so this is something which might also be difficult to do, in the sense that how do you measure what is the level of deprivations? How do you go ahead with that?
Yeah, Sarthak, I think you are trying to think of this as some central utility has the answer, has both the data and the answer. That I don't think we can answer it that way. I think you have to effectively both collect and administer solutions at a very, very decentralized level. The money can come potentially flow down through a special finance commission kind of method, but the actual solutions will have to come at a district level, or at a potentially cluster of village taluk level answer, rather than at the level of all the data and the gaps are identified centrally. I think there's going to be a lot of definition of this at a much more decentralized level. I don't know, Nitin, whether you've thought through this.
Yeah. See, administratively, I know these ideas of commissions and committees has a bad rap because they're mostly used to sort of cold store, put some ideas in cold storage. But administratively, they do have some utility and function. And I can think of this as a fantastic and appropriate opportunity to have something like that, where you have a special commission set up to identify the key problem areas and intervention areas for which are required. This can be a government organized commission, but of course with people from outside, and then prioritize them for which are the ones which government bracket union will do, the government bracket states will do, which are the areas where they want CSR money to go in, and philanthropists can put in money here, employers can go in. So I think a broad plan like this can be created such that there is some kind of alignment of effort at a national scale. I mean, alignment of effort in India doesn't mean a very sharp vector, going in one direction. It's a broad, very, very broad India kind of alignment, which is good enough, because that is better than complete non-alignment or chaos, right? And I think there is a case for that, for a very methodical, non-judgmental, non-partisan kind of a national commission which looks at this and says, look, this is the most severe blow the country has received since independence, or probably even before independence. I can't think of anything which has affected the country in such a dramatic manner in the last 100 years at least. And the reason, therefore, is that for the nation come together to have a national response to this. I don't think it's there's anything to be ashamed of. There's every country has suffered this, and if you look at even big traumas in national lives of other countries after World War II, every country that suffered large numbers of casualties, suffered the pain, went through some kind of an organized process to see, okay, we've had this blow. This is what has happened. Now we've got to figure out what are we going to do next, right? What is our strategy after that? I don't think India has done that, because I think we've tried to take it on our chin and then move on and say, look, everything is fine. We're going to tide this over like we've tided over everything else. I think that approach is wrong, because it just ignores the what we've been talking about, the structural, fundamental inequalities that, unless we act upon now, will have tremendous moral and economic consequences. And I'm concerned about both, because I cannot, in good conscience, accept the fact that we have seen these incidents happen. These are the people who have clearly suffered for no fault of their own. And these are the most vulnerable people in addition to that. And we've not been able to do anything for them, right? So there is a moral imperative for us to act. And there is also an instrumental one, because unless we are able to fix this problem, we're not going to get the kind of economic growth that the rest of us need. The rest of us fortunate ones who've not suffered as much as the others, we are not going to be able to, grow and prosper to the extent that we could either, right? So that's how I see this. You have to treat this as a national calamity, which deserves a national response, and government has an alignment function to perform.
Yeah, Nitin, let me just make one point of clarification. I think we need to be careful with the word vulnerable, because it has a certain semantic. And while there is a large overlap with vulnerable and the economic class definition, I don't think in this case it is 100% aligned to a class definition. So, say, take even workers in different sectors. I think people in different sectors are disproportionately impacted, right? So, construction was impacted in a very, very negative way, but bizarrely in the second lockdown, construction began to be permitted very, very early. So in the second lockdown, construction impact was far less than it was in the first lockdown, where nobody paid any attention to the nuances. But we are still not in a lockdown, and yet restauranting, except for delivery-based restauranting, is severely impacted. So I mean that has a service level impact on hundreds of thousands of employees who've still not been able to get out of that impact quite yet. So I think while there is a broad correlation with what we would understand as the word vulnerable in general, it's not a one-for-one kind of map. And this commission or this line of inquiry needs to establish both the overlap and the difference between these various groups that are impacted. And in particular, as Nitin briefly mentioned earlier, I think women are impacted very badly. It's very nuanced as to what this vulnerable group means, and we need to take multiple cuts at it to arrive at sort of a better and more precise.
See, I think the gender dimension is, again, this is what I mean by vulnerable and problematic, because even before the pandemic, the workforce participation rate of women was falling, right? And now during the pandemic, you've seen many places the retrenchments have happened first, affecting women, and then you have them working from home and the attendant difficulties. So this is the vulnerable part, and I think we have to clarify that we are not in the Piketty definition of inequality or Piketty definition or the left liberal definition of vulnerable, right? This is very clearly not referring to class or hard coded brackets of people, but dynamically, in the broadest sense, people who have vulnerable in the sense not able to respond and come back much stronger after having suffered a blow.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Yeah, I think it's important to make that distinction. That said, I am optimistic that if we apply our mind to it, we can mitigate, if not eradicate, this problem and reduce the gap to resetting everybody to the same baseline, right? And which I think is necessary for India to continue on its developmental journey. I mean, the reform imperative doesn't change. That remains, and if anything, has become even more stark now than before. That the reform imperative contributes into your 8% goal, Nitin, which is the answer to many of India's problem is to continue to grow, which is absolutely true. But if we continue to grow without addressing this sudden gap that has emerged, then we will grow in a very imbalanced way. And that sows the seeds for a lot of societal angst. And in a democratic society, that is not a sustainable way to move forward if you have volatility built into your democratic society.
Yes, and I think on that note, the two ends shall meet again.
Yeah, thanks Nitin, thanks Narayan for the wide-ranging discussion. Thanks to the listeners for tuning in to All Things Policy. We'll meet again in one more episode.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshahila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.
From uncensored and unfiltered chats with the who's who of the entertainment industry, I, Siddharth Kannan, bring your very hardcore chat show called Candid Kannan. Tune in every Friday on the IVM Podcast app or wherever you get your podcasts.
Given the unprecedented times our nation is going through, where positive is now a dreaded word, Smile India gets you delightful news from across the country about people and places that continue to spread the much-needed hope and positive vibes. I am Shifa Maitra, and you can hear Smile India with me every Thursday on the IVM app, website, or wherever you get your podcasts from. Oh, and did I tell you Smile India is available in both English and Hindi.